Chapter 3 Four Brave Fellas. Now it came to pass in those days that bandits roamed the eastern roads, where the old Duke's law had grown weak and desperate men sought easy prey. Among these outlaws were four who called themselves Brothers Cale the Cautious, Jorin the Bitter, and young Fen and Grek, who followed where stronger men led. They had robbed many travellers upon the disputed roads, and their hands were not clean of blood. The traveller stopped as the four men emerged from the tree line, their crude weapons glinting dull and low in the afternoon light. They fanned out in a ragged half-circle, their eyes flicking over his worn but clean garments and the heavy pack upon his back. "Lost your way, friend?" the biggest one asked, a notched blade held loose in his hand. His voice carried the false courtesy of a wolf inviting a lamb to supper. "You look a little far from home." The wizard sighed, the sound barely audible, like wind through dead grass, and settled his grip on his walking stick. His expression was one of profound, empty weariness, as though he'd walked this road 1,000 times before and found it wanting every time. He looked at the leader and said, his voice flat as stone, "You are on the wrong road." A bandit with a greasy beard laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "He thinks he has a choice in the matter. Where are you headed, old man? Who's expecting you at the end of this road?" The wizard didn't flinch. He just looked at the ground, and a sad, short phrase escaped his lips. "Just leave me be." The laughter turned to a sneer. "Listen to him. Doesn't want to talk. Where's your horse, old man? Temple brothers usually travel in pairs or with guards. Perhaps your master sent you out alone, thinking you're not worth protecting?" "My path is mine alone," the wizard said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at them with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, somber melancholy, like a man who has seen the ending of too many stories and knows how this one must end as well. "You have no notion what you're dealing with." The leader's face hardened. He read the words not as a threat, but as a weak man's final plea. "All right, that's enough of your prattle. Look at him, boys. Got that big pack and no friends to speak of. No horse. He's not expected anywhere. No soul will look for him when he fails to arrive." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. "I'll ask you one more time, and mark me well. Is there anyone who will come seeking you if you don't show up?" The wizard met his gaze. He could have lied, could have spun some grand tale of a mighty lord's garrison awaiting him, of soldiers who would hunt down any who delayed him, but his weary soul couldn't be bothered with such fabrications. He just gave the simple, painful truth. "No. There is no one to miss me." The bandits looked at one another. The last of their hesitation was gone, dissolved like morning mist before sun. The leader's teeth flashed in a cruel grin, and his mouth began to open to give the command. Then the grin faltered. He paused, a flicker of something he could not name passing across his weathered face. The other bandits were already tensing, ready to lunge like starving dogs upon a crippled deer, but he held up a hand and they froze. He looked back at the lone traveller, at his quiet, sad eyes, and the question echoed in his mind, louder than any of his men's grunts or growls. "Why no fear?" This was the part where men got upon their knees and begged for their miserable lives. They offered to double what they had, promised silver hidden back home, screamed for their mothers like babes torn from the teat. This one had just stood there, sighing as though bored. And that last phrase, it was not a lie meant to inspire mercy, nor a threat disguised as honesty. It was a truth so lonely and profound that it struck the leader with a sudden, cold sense of unease. Why would a man about to die admit such a thing? Why would he not make up a story about gods or companions? It made no sense. And in the disputed lands, things that made no sense were almost always a sign of a trap. A hidden crossbowman in the trees, mayhap, or a sorcerer's trick. The leader's eyes narrowed, not with malice now, but with suspicion. He lowered his hand, gripping the hilt of his short sword tighter. "Wait," he said, his voice now lower, losing its swagger like a sail losing wind. He pointed a finger at the travelers' pack, the one they had all been eyeing like starving men eyeing a feast. "That pack. What's in it? Tell me, and tell me true." The wizard didn't look at the man. His gaze was fixed on the middle distance, as if the path ahead was the only thing in all the world that mattered. "Things," he said, the single word flat and without inflection. The answer, so simple and dismissive, was like a slap across the face. The bandit leader's carefully constructed composure began to crack like ice beneath a heavy boot. He stamped a foot into the dirt, frustration burning through his bravado. He started to pace in a tight circle around the unmoving traveler, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. "Listen to me, you old fool. Don't you know what's about to happen to you? You're going to empty that pack, and if we don't like what we see, we'll take a finger for every lie you've told us. And perhaps an eye as well, for good measure." He watched the wizard's face, desperate for a change in expression, a tremble in his hands, anything that would give him reason to justify this robbery, to make it feel right. But there was nothing. No fear. Just that same quiet, sad stare, like a man watching rain fall on graves. It made no sense. No man acts this way. The others didn't seem to notice. They were just itching for the fight, for the blood and the silver. The second in command, a brutish man with a crooked nose and scars that told of a hard life, growled deep in his throat. "He's not giving us anything. Let's just do it and get this sorry business over with." He took a step forward, his hand on the hilt of his worn short sword. "Stand down," the leader barked, his voice laced with a sudden, genuine fear that surprised even himself. He threw a hand out and shoved the man back, his eyes never leaving the wizard's face. The man stumbled and glared at him, a silent question burning in his eyes like hot coals. The leader ignored him. He was trapped now. He couldn't back down, not in front of his men. They would call him weak, cowardly. The opportunity was too good to abandon. But every instinct he had, every dark whisper of fear he'd ever learned to heed, was screaming at him that this man was wrong. He was a puzzle with a bloody answer, and the leader had to solve it before that answer painted the road red. But what was the riddle? "You're not afraid," the leader said, the threat gone from his voice, replaced by a desperate, low whisper. "Why aren't you afraid?" Jorin's thoughts. A low growl rumbled in Jorin's throat as he stumbled back, shoving the leader's arm off of him. The man's name was Kale, and for as long as Jorin had known him, 3 hard years of cold camps and hungry bellies, he'd had a way of sniffing out danger others missed. Like a hound that can smell sickness on a man. But this was not danger. This was just a man on a road. A man with a fat pack, and no horse, and nothing but some tired words for weapons. What's wrong with him? Jorin's knuckles were white around the hilt of his short sword. He glanced at the wizard, a simple man with a simple face, grey beard and worn clothes. He should have been on his knees already, his head in the dirt, begging for mercies they wouldn't grant. But he was not, and Kale, the man who was supposed to be leading them, was just staring at him like a child stares at a spirit light in the woods. Jorin had seen men act like this before on the battlefield, their minds broken by what they'd witnessed, their feet rooted to the mud even as the swords came down on them. He'd seen it after the flux took a village near the eastern marshes last year, survivors just standing there, staring at nothing, while their children's bodies lay rotting in their homes. But this was not battle. This was not plague. This was a robbery, simple as breaking bread. A head should have been on the ground already, and the silver counted out and divided. He thought back to last winter when Kale had made them ride an extra day out of their way, all because he had a bad feeling about a certain pass through the mountains. They had all grumbled, called him cautious as an old woman, and the next day, a rival gang had been ambushed on that very road, cut down to a man. Kale was lucky. He was clever, too, sometimes. But he was not a man who solved problems with a blade, not first. He was a thinker, and it always held them up, made them lose opportunities. Jorin looked at the third and fourth bandits, their faces a mix of confusion and impatience. They wanted to move. They wanted the silver, wanted the pack opened and its contents divided. The wizard's strange defiance meant nothing to them, and their leader's hesitation made even less sense. Was Cale losing his edge? Was he too soft to do what needed doing? Perhaps the long, hard winter when they'd had to eat their own horses and bury two men who'd frozen in their bedrolls had made him weak, more afraid of the ghosts in his own head than of a man who was about to die. Jorin looked from the wizard's calm, empty eyes to Cale's nervous, searching ones. And for the first time, a clear, dangerous thought formed in his mind like ice forming on a pond. He's not worthy of being a leader if he can't even kill a man who's begging for it. The lower men. The two low-ranking bandits stood side by side, shifting their weight from one foot to the other like dogs waiting for scraps. Their names were Fen and Greg, and they had not said a word since they'd walked out of the trees. They didn't need to. Their minds were on simple things, the cold air that was biting through their threadbare cloaks, the weight of weapons in their hands, and the promise of coin. Fen, the older of the two at perhaps 20 winters, had been with the group for less than a season. He'd joined after his village had burned, whether by bandits or by the Lord's men collecting and paid taxes. He neither knew nor cared anymore. All that mattered was survival, and survival meant following men who knew how to take what they needed. His wife had died in the fire along with their infant son, both caught in the cottage when the thatch went up like tinder. He'd tried to save them. The burns on his arms were still pink and tender beneath his sleeves. Greg was even younger, scarce 17, with the soft face of a boy who had not yet grown into his bones. He'd been a shepherd once, before the wolves took his flock and his master beat him bloody for the loss, broke 3 of his ribs and left him for dead in the snow. He'd run away with nothing but the clothes on his back and a stolen knife. Joining Cale's band had been the first bit of luck he'd had in his miserable life. Neither of them understood what was happening. They saw their leaders strong men, hard men, men who had killed before, frozen like rabbits before a snake. They saw an old man with a pack standing there doing nothing. And they saw an opportunity slipping away with every moment of hesitation. Greg's hand tightened on his crude hatchet. He'd taken it from a dead woodcutter 2 months past, and it was the finest thing he'd ever owned. He was tired of waiting, tired of watching, tired of being the lowest, the last to eat, the first to be sent into danger when there was danger to be sent into. Fen felt the same impatience burning in his gut. He'd held that heavy cudgel through the winter, dreaming of the day he'd use it to take what was his by right of strength. What was the point of being a bandit if you stood around talking all day? The wizard speaks. The traveler looked at the leader and the second-in-command, and for the first time, his gaze held a quiet, weary weight like a man forced to speak when silence would be kindness. His voice was soft, barely a murmur, but it cut through the tense silence like a knife through silk. "This is not a road for you to be stranded on," he said. Jorin's breath hitched in his throat. The words were simple, unremarkable. But the way the wizard said them with such certainty, such knowledge, made something cold crawl down his spine. He saw the glint in the traveler's eyes, and suddenly he was back on the deck of that cursed ship, feeling the rough hemp of the rope binding his wrists to the mast, tasting salt on his cracked lips as the crew he'd tried to betray left him to die. The traveler's gaze shifted to Cale, who stood with his arms still outstretched, blocking his men from their prey. "And the price you paid to stand so tall," the traveler continued, his voice like wind through a graveyard, "will not be enough to buy you a story here. The 2 men who knew your secret are dead, but secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried with their keepers." Cale's face went white as fresh fallen snow. The words were a knife twisting in a wound he had killed to close. He was no longer looking at a traveler, but at a living ghost of his past, a phantom of the two dead men who knew his deepest shame, how he'd murdered his former partners when they'd mocked him for cowardice, how he'd cut their throats in their sleep and told the others they'd deserted in the night. To Fen and Grek, the words meant nothing. They just saw their leaders standing frozen, staring at a harmless old man who was rambling about prices and secrets and roads. What madness was this? Jorin, however, was no longer looking at the traveler's eyes. He was staring at the ground, cold sweat breaking out on his brow despite the chill air. The traveler had no magic, not the flashy kind with lightning and fire that minstrels sang about in taverns. He had something worse, something far more terrible. He had knowledge that should not exist. He knew a thing about a ship, a thing about a mutiny, and a thing about a boy tied to a mast and left to die. Things that only Jorin should know, things he'd never told another living soul. The silence on the road was absolute, broken only by the wind in the bare branches above. The four bandits had come to intimidate one man, to take his silver and perhaps his life if he proved troublesome. Instead, they had been judged, weighed, and found wanting. They were all trapped now, caught not by a physical force they could fight, but by the unseen burden of their pasts reaching up from the grave to clutch at their throats. The attack. The two leaders stood frozen, the traveler's words hanging in the air between them like smoke that will not dissipate. Jorin's eyes were wide with a terror he had not felt since his last moments upon that cursed ship, when he'd thought for certain he would die alone and unmourned. Beside him, Kale's hand went limp, his sword slipping from numb fingers to hit the dirt with a soft, unnoticed thud. Their world had just been shattered by a few simple, terrifying phrases that should not have been possible. But Fen and Grek had not heard the words, not truly. They'd heard sounds, but comprehended not their meaning. They only saw two men who had seemed so powerful moments ago completely lose their nerve like green boys in their first fight. They saw a traveler standing there, unmoving and unthreatening, and the fat pack upon his back promising warmth and food and coin. They saw an opportunity. Without a word between them, a lifetime of frustration and impatience bubbling over like a pot left too long upon the fire, Fen and Grek snapped. They charged, their primitive weapons raised high. Grek lunged from the side with his crude hatchet, aiming at the traveler's head with all the strength his young arms could muster. Fen swung his heavy cudgel at the man's legs, meaning to cripple first and rob after. The four men formed a rough, impromptu circle, the traveler the silent, a moving center of a storm of violence about to break. At the exact moment of contact when steel should have met flesh, when wood should have cracked bone, a ripple seemed to pass through the very air itself. There was no flash of light, no gust of wind, no crack of thunder, just a shimmer, like heat haze upon a summer road, that no mortal eye could have truly marked. It was there and then it was gone, a silent breath of movement so subtle it might have been imagined. And suddenly, impossibly, the center of the circle was empty. The traveler was no longer there. He was now upon the far side of the two leaders, already walking away down the road, his pace steady and unhurried. He had somehow passed through the men, through the circle of weapons, through the very space where steel was falling, with an ease that was profoundly, terribly wrong. The two attacks, meant for the traveler's head and legs, landed instead upon the leaders. Grek's hatchet scraped harmlessly off Kale's shoulder, tearing through his tunic and leaving a long, shallow cut across the leather beneath. Had it struck its intended target, it would have split a skull. Fen's cudgel caught the side of Jorin's helmet with a resounding clang, and the dull thud that followed spoke of metal dented and a head left ringing. The four of them stood there in utter silence, a tableau of confusion so complete it bordered upon the absurd. The two low-rank bandits stood with their weapons still raised, their chests heaving, their faces gone pale as they realized what they'd done. Cale clutched his shoulder, feeling the warm, sticky trail of blood seeping through his torn tunic. Jorin stood motionless, his ears ringing like temple bells, a fresh dent visible in his battered helmet. They looked from their fresh wounds to the empty spot in the center of the circle, and then to the traveler, who was already a dozen paces down the road, walking away as though nothing at all had occurred. No one had an explanation. No one could speak. The simple robbery had dissolved into an act of violence against their own, but the target, the one man who should have been bleeding upon the ground, had walked away without a scratch upon him. The fracture. The leader's authority, built on 3 years of successful raids and the fear of his quick knife, crumbled in that single moment like a sand castle before the tide. Cale was still clutching his bleeding shoulder, staring at the crimson stain spreading across his tunic, when Jorin slowly and deliberately drew his short sword. The scraping of metal leaving leather was the loudest sound on the empty road, loud as a scream in a temple. Jorin pointed the blade at Cale, and his voice when he spoke was cold as a winter grave. "You failed to act when action was needed. And you showed them," he gestured at Fen and Grek with his free hand, "that we are nothing. That our leader is paralyzed by phantoms and old wives' tales. We're done with you, Cale. Done following a man who fears his own shadow." This was his second mutiny. The first had failed, left him bound to a mast to die. But he had no fear now, only a cold, hard resolve born of betrayal remembered. The captain of this sorry ship would pay for his weakness, would pay for making them all look like fools. Cale met his gaze, and for the first time since the traveler had spoken those terrible words, the panic in his eyes was replaced by a hollow acceptance. There was no point in fighting, he knew. The group was already gone, dissolved like salt in water. The moment Jorin had drawn his blade, it was over. He watched as Fen and Grek, their faces pale with terror at what they'd accidentally done and what was now unfolding before them, took one look at the sight of the two leaders turning on each other and bolted. They ran back toward the forest without a word, without a backward glance, their primitive loyalty dissolved in a sudden, animal fear. Better to take their chances alone in the woods than to stay and see how this ended. Jorin's eyes flickered to the two fleeing forms, and the sudden realization of his hollow victory hit him like a fist to the gut. He had his mutiny. He had his vengeance against a leader who'd proven himself unworthy. But as the last sounds of Fen and Grek's frantic footsteps faded into the woods, he was left with nothing but the echo of his own anger. He stood on the road, his sword pointed at a man who no longer even had a group to lead. The mutiny had succeeded, but it had also failed. He was a leader with no followers, a king of a kingdom that had just ceased to exist, a victor in a battle that had already been lost before the first blow was struck. The two men stood there in the fading afternoon light, staring at each other across 3 feet of dusty road. Neither moved. Neither spoke. They were trapped in a moment neither had chosen, bound together by the knowledge that whatever happened next, they had both already lost. Far down the road, the traveler walked on, and did not look back. The scattering. By nightfall, the 4 men had gone their separate ways. Fen and Grek, the younger ones, had run west into the forest and would not stop running until their legs gave out. They would find a village eventually, lie about their names and their pasts, try to start anew. Perhaps they would succeed. Perhaps not. Either way, they would never speak of what happened on that road, not even to each other. Cale, his shoulder still bleeding through the makeshift bandage he'd tied, limped north toward the mountains. He had kin there, distant cousins who might take him in if he told them the right lies. But he would never lead men again. The moment Jorin had drawn steel on him, something inside had broken that couldn't be mended. He would spend his remaining years looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows, waiting for the betrayal he knew must eventually come. And Jorin, Jorin stood alone on that empty road as darkness fell, his sword still in his hand, staring at the spot where the traveler had been. He had won his mutiny. He had proven himself right. The weak leader had been cast down, just as Jorin had always known he should be. But the victory tasted of ashes and dust. He thought of the ship, of the first mutiny that had failed, of being tied to the mast while men he'd thought were friends took turns with the whip, of the captain's laughter and the crew's mockery and the shame that had burned worse than the sun on his raw back. He thought of how the traveler had known, had spoken of stranded men and prices paid and secrets that should have been buried with the dead. "What are you?" he whispered to the empty road. "What manner of thing walks in the shape of a man?" No answer came, only the wind in the trees and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Jorin sheathed his sword and began walking east toward the disputed lands where men asked few questions and cared less about a man's past, toward the places where the old laws held no sway and the boundary between the living world and the sealed eastern darkness grew thinner each year. He would find others like himself, broken men, desperate men, men with nothing left to lose. He would build a new group, stronger than before. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and sleep would not come, he would remember a traveler on a dusty road who had looked into his soul and found it wanting. And he would shudder despite himself, and wonder if someday that traveler might return to finish what he'd begun. The pattern. In the months that followed, stories would spread through the disputed lands. Strange stories, whispered in taverns and around campfires. Of a tall man with blue eyes who walked alone and unmolested through the most dangerous territories. Of bandits who tried to rob him and ended up destroying themselves, though he never raised a hand in violence. Of a wanderer who knew things he should not know, spoke words that cut deeper than any blade. Some called him a sorcerer. Some said he was a spirit of judgment, walking the roads to punish the wicked. Some claimed he was just a madman who got lucky, that the stories were exaggerated with each telling. But those who had actually encountered him knew better. They knew that something walked among them wearing the shape of a man, something that saw too clearly and remembered too much. Something that left broken minds in its wake as surely as a sword left broken bodies. And they learned, slowly but surely, to give the eastern roads a wide berth, to avoid the paths where strange travelers were reported, to let some prey escape rather than risk an encounter with the one who measured and judged and found them all wanting. The disputed lands were hard places, full of hard men, but even hard men can learn fear. And so the roads grew a little quieter, a little safer, not through force of arms but through the whispered warning passed from one desperate soul to another. Stay clear of the man with the blue eyes. Stay clear of the one who walks alone, for he knows your secrets, and his knowing is a weapon sharper than any blade. Far away, in a tower on an island, the wizard called Fenris made a new mark on his walking stick. Another knot for another place visited, another line for another day endured. The work continued. The measurements must be taken, the boundary must be maintained.